She froze. The envelope trembled in her hands. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, had read many letters, many notices, even many contracts, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for the Queen's final wishes. And yet, here it was, laid bare in ink and sealed with an insignia that spoke of authority, history, and irrevocable decisions. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, like the entire monarchy had settled its judgment upon her. Every heartbeat was a drum of disbelief, every breath a gasp against the reality she couldn't yet fully comprehend. The Queen's Will, a document meant to preserve legacy, to protect history, to ensure order in a world built on tradition. And yet, in this moment, it felt like a weapon, a carefully calibrated blow aimed not just at the balance of the royal estate, but at Meghan personally. Her eyes flickered over the lines, each sentence a stab. Catherine, her sister-in-law, received everything, literally everything. The estates, the jewels, the personal effects that spoke of decades of dedication, the wealth that commanded influence across continents. And Meghan? Not a word, not a single inheritance, not a hint of favor, not even a gesture of goodwill. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How could this be? How could the Queen, who had always maintained the facade of impartiality, choose to leave Meghan out entirely? Was this oversight? An accident of drafting? Or was there something far more intentional behind it? Could it be the culmination of years of whispered tensions, of palace gossip, of subtle but undeniable signs that Meghan had never truly belonged? The questions churned like storm clouds in her mind, dark and threatening, each one heavier than the last. It wasn't just the exclusion that stung, it was the contrast. Catherine, poised, graceful, endlessly calculating in her calm, had been granted the keys to a legacy that Meghan had once believed she would help shape, influence, and perhaps even modernize. It was not merely a difference in inheritance, it was a statement, a quiet, yet deafening declaration of preference, of favor, of lineage preserved in its most traditional, unquestionable form. And Meghan? She was a shadow at the periphery of that power. Her contributions, her sacrifices, her life in the public eye seemingly erased in the Queen's final act of judgment. The room around her seemed to shrink. Courtiers, aides, and staffers, who had delivered the document with solemn faces, now waited in silence. No one spoke. No one dared. The air was thick with tension, as if every person present sensed that the moment was larger than a piece of paper. It was a moment that could fracture relationships, redefine legacies, and alter public perception forever. Meghan's hand trembled, and for the first time in years, doubt crept in, cold, biting, and unrelenting. Had she misjudged the royal family? Misread the signals? Misplaced her trust? And yet, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She would not, could not, be merely a passive victim in this story. If the world believed she was broken, if the press assumed she would quietly step aside, they were gravely mistaken. Meghan had faced scrutiny, criticism, and scandal before. She had endured the relentless glare of a media machine that seemed to exist solely to dismantle her dignity. But this, the will, was different. This was personal. This cut to the very core of her ambitions, her security, and the narrative of her life within the monarchy. Could it be that the Queen's decision was strategic? That by favoring Catherine, she was reinforcing a power dynamic that had always existed beneath the polished veneer of public appearances? Catherine, the ever-composed, ever-strategic Duchess of Cambridge, had cultivated a presence that blended respectability with influence. She had navigated the treacherous waters of royalty with a measured elegance, earning the favor of the institution that Meghan had struggled to understand, let alone integrate into. Was this a reward for loyalty, for conformity, for playing the game exactly as expected? And if so, what did it say about Meghan's place, or lack thereof, in the royal tapestry? Meghan's thoughts raced. The public would not understand, and the media would exploit every detail, every nuance, every expression of emotion. Headlines would scream, "Royal rift widening, Meghan snubbed, Catherine inherits, Meghan excluded." Social media would erupt with speculation, memes, and outrage. Fans and critics alike would dissect every word, every gesture, every previous comment made by Meghan and Catherine. It was a storm waiting to be unleashed, and she was in the eye of it, caught between the desire for private grief and the inevitability of public spectacle. Yet there was also strategy to consider. Meghan was not one to remain passive for long. She had allies, advisors, and confidants who could help her navigate this unprecedented humiliation. Legal avenues could be explored, public relations campaigns orchestrated, narratives shaped and reframed. But each step carried risk. Every action would be scrutinized, judged, dissected, and potentially weaponized against her. The palace, after all, was a living organism of protocol, hierarchy, and influence. To disrupt, it was to challenge centuries of tradition. And Meghan, whether by choice or circumstance, had just been thrown into the center of that challenge. She thought of Harry, her husband, her partner, her fellow rebel against the constraints of tradition, would surely feel this as keenly as she did. His loyalty, his protective instincts, and his own complicated relationship with the royal family all intersected in this moment. Would he support her openly, risk confrontation, or counsel caution? The questions were endless, and the answers were not immediate. The royal family, after decades of cultivating public facades, operated on silent codes and unspoken rules. Every move was watched, every reaction catalogued. Meghan's next steps would be pivotal, not just for her, but for the narrative that the world would construct around her. The shock began to settle into a cold, simmering fury. Meghan's mind shifted from disbelief to calculation. There would be no dramatic outburst here, no tears shed in front of staff or aides. This was a moment for strategy, for subtlety, for planning. Yet beneath the composed exterior, emotions churned. Hurt, anger, frustration, betrayal. They all coexisted, intertwining in a complex web that would drive her decisions in the days, weeks, and months to come. The monarchy had made its statement. And Meghan? She would have to respond in kind. Every story has a turning point, a moment when the protagonist faces the challenge that will define them. This, reading the Queen's will, seeing Catherine elevated while she herself was excluded, was that moment for Meghan. It was a test of resilience, of ingenuity, and of sheer willpower. Would she retreat into silence, conform to the expectations placed upon her, and accept her exclusion as fate? Or would she rise, confront, and challenge the very structures that sought to diminish her? The world would be watching. The cameras, the headlines, the social media commentary, all of it would converge to amplify every choice, every action, every expression of emotion. And yet, there was a flicker of hope. Meghan had always been resourceful, intelligent, and remarkably adaptive. She had faced obstacles before, some seemingly insurmountable, and had navigated them with a combination of courage and strategy. The Queen's will was not merely a statement of exclusion. It was an invitation, a provocation. It challenged Meghan to respond, to assert herself, and to define her own legacy independent of the structures that sought to confine her. In that sense, the moment was both devastating and empowering, a paradox that would shape the trajectory of her actions and her story in the months to come. But the question remained, what would Meghan do next? Would she allow the sting of exclusion to dominate her, to define her, to dictate her narrative? Or would she harness the fury, the disappointment, and the shock, and transform it into a force capable of reshaping perceptions, influencing outcomes, and even challenging the very foundation of royal expectation? The answer was unclear. And that uncertainty, the tension, the suspense, the raw human emotion, was exactly what made this story impossible to look away from. Every reader, every viewer, every member of the public would be compelled to watch, to wait, to anticipate. Because when Meghan Markle is pushed to the edge, when the institutions of power and tradition seek to limit her, the results are never quiet. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The envelope had been there for days, sitting on the polished mahogany desk in the private study, its presence almost imperceptible until the moment Meghan finally dared to open it. She had avoided it at first, telling herself that timing mattered, that preparation was key. But curiosity, and perhaps a sense of inevitability, had won. She broke the seal with hands that trembled just slightly, a gesture small enough to betray nothing to the casual observer, yet monumental in the intimate gravity of the moment. Inside lay the Queen's final wishes. Carefully worded, elegantly drafted, the document carried a weight far beyond the simple inheritance of material wealth. It was the culmination of decades of life, of decisions, of history, and of power consolidated in black ink. As Meghan read, a chill coursed through her. Every line, every paragraph seemed deliberate, precise, and, worst of all, decisive in its exclusion of her. Catherine's name appeared again and again, tied to estates, properties, and personal collections that had long been the stuff of royal legend. Sandringham, Balmoral, jewels of staggering historical significance, priceless art, and personal mementos all designated for Catherine, the ever-composed, ever-advancing Duchess of Cambridge. And Meghan? Her name appeared nowhere. Not as a token, not in passing, not even as a courtesy of recognition. It was a silence so loud, so deliberate, it resonated through the very walls of her private chamber. The first emotion that gripped her was disbelief. Meghan had navigated royal life with careful attention, had endured intense scrutiny and criticism, had adjusted to expectations that sometimes seemed impossible. She had thought that her marriage, her role, and her public service were enough to earn recognition, if not admiration, from the monarch herself. And yet here it was, a stark, undeniable omission. How could this happen? Meghan's mind raced with possibilities, as if frantically searching for an explanation that could make this bearable. Had there been a mistake? Could the royal advisors, the legal draftsmen, have somehow overlooked her? The idea seemed ludicrous, impossible. The monarchy was meticulous, every signature, every seal, every document vetted to perfection. Exclusion from the Queen's will could not be accidental. As Meghan sat back in the leather chair, staring at the document, other thoughts began to creep in. The public narrative, already precarious and fraught with scrutiny, would be explosive. If the news leaked, as it inevitably would, the media would descend like vultures. Headlines would scream betrayal, favoritism, scandal. Meghan snubbed by the Queen, they would write. Catherine's crown grows taller. Social media would erupt with commentary, memes, and speculation. And the public, ever hungry for drama and division within the royal family, would demand answers, none of which Meghan was ready to give. Her emotions, raw and unfiltered, began to shift. Disbelief gave way to a cold, simmering anger. Exclusion from the will was not merely a personal slight. It was a public statement. It was a judgment on her presence within the family, her perceived role, and, perhaps most painfully, her worthiness in the eyes of a monarch whose approval mattered more than anyone else's. Catherine, calm, poised, and strategically brilliant, had been elevated. Meghan, energetic, outspoken, and sometimes controversial, had been erased. The contrast was glaring, inescapable, and impossible to ignore. What did it mean for Harry? Her husband, the one person she could rely on to understand the gravity of this blow, would feel it too. They had always been partners, united against the relentless pressures of royal life and media intrusion. How would he respond to this exclusion? Would he fight, as he had in past conflicts, or counsel caution, seeking to preserve appearances and avoid further scandal? The thought alone added another layer of complexity to an already delicate emotional landscape. As she digested the contents of the will, Meghan began to reflect on the implications beyond immediate inheritance. Influence, power, and control were intertwined with wealth in the monarchy. By leaving everything to Catherine, the Queen had effectively consolidated authority in a specific direction. Catherine's position as a future queen consort, and as a potential central figure in the monarchy, was reinforced. Meghan's absence, conversely, sent a message that her influence was not to be counted upon, that her role within the family was secondary, peripheral, perhaps even expendable. Meghan's mind wandered to the past, to the moments of subtle tension, the whispered criticisms, the veiled hints of disapproval. She remembered private conversations with aides, remarks from extended family, and the occasional glare from seasoned courtiers. Could all of this have been preparing her for this moment? Had she misread the signals, believing that her charm, dedication, and efforts to modernize aspects of royal life would suffice to earn a place of respect and inclusion? The thought was almost too painful to bear. And yet, beneath the initial shock and anger, a strategic calculation began to emerge. Meghan was not one to succumb to despair or passive victimhood. She had navigated the treacherous waters of public life before, often under scrutiny far harsher than she had ever anticipated. Legal avenues could be explored, public narratives could be managed, and private discussions with key advisors could be initiated. Each option carried risk, yes, but inaction would be far worse. The Queen's will was a statement. Meghan's response, whatever form it might take, could become a defining moment in her life and career. Her thoughts inevitably turned to the media. How would the tabloids portray her reaction? Would they focus on tears, anger, or stoicism? The paparazzi had already been relentless, capturing every nuance of her public appearances, scrutinizing her expressions for hints of scandal or tension. Social media, with its instantaneous judgment and viral potential, would amplify every move. Headlines would be written before she had a chance to process her emotions fully. And yet, the opportunity to control the narrative, to present her perspective, existed, but only if approached with precision, tact, and timing. As the hours passed, Meghan considered the broader implications for the family dynamic. The royal household was an intricate web of relationships, alliances, and unspoken codes. Every decision, every gesture, every word carried weight. Catherine's elevation was not merely a personal gain, it was a shift in balance. Other family members, from siblings to advisors, would react, consciously or subconsciously, to this redistribution of power and favor. Meghan's position, already fraught with tension and occasional conflict, had been irrevocably altered. She would need to navigate these waters carefully, balancing assertiveness with diplomacy, emotion with strategy. And then, a realization struck. This was not just about inheritance, not just about personal slights, not just about the optics of royal life. This was about identity, legacy, and the story that would be told for generations. Meghan had worked tirelessly to define herself not merely as a duchess, but as a figure capable of affecting change, of challenging tradition, of leaving a lasting impact. The Queen's exclusion threatened to undermine that narrative, to paint her as an outsider, a peripheral figure, a woman denied recognition in the very institution she had entered with hope and ambition. Yet, Meghan was nothing if not resilient. In her mind, she began to plot, to strategize, to consider every possible avenue for reclaiming influence, for asserting presence, for responding to what she increasingly recognized as a calculated slight. The Queen's will was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown in her path. And Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, was never one to walk away from a challenge. But the question remained, how far would she go? How would she balance loyalty, love, ambition, and the risk of scandal? The answers were not immediately clear. And as she folded the will carefully, placing it back in its envelope, Meghan realized that the days to come would be decisive, dramatic, and potentially explosive. The palace, the public, and the media would watch every move, every expression, every decision. The stage was set, and the story was only beginning. The Queen's will had revealed its secrets. Catherine's windfall was monumental. Meghan's exclusion undeniable. And yet, in that silence, in that quiet storm of thought and emotion, one thing was certain: Meghan would respond. The question was how, and what consequences would follow. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The grand halls of the palace, with their polished floors and portraits of monarchs past, seemed to close in around Meghan Markle. To the outside world, they were symbols of tradition, stability, and elegance. To Meghan, at this moment, they were a cage, each gilded frame a reminder of her exclusion. The Queen's will had laid bare a stark reality. Catherine would inherit everything, and Meghan would inherit nothing. And as the initial shock began to settle, it was replaced by a more insidious, creeping tension. The palace, the very institution she had entered with ambition and hope, now felt like a labyrinth, each corridor lined with whispers, each doorway a potential trap. Inside her private chambers, Meghan paced, her mind racing. She had advisors, yes, trusted aides who had been with her through public appearances, media crises, and the relentless scrutiny of the press, but even they could not shield her from the personal sting of exclusion. Every decision she made now would be scrutinized. Every gesture, every expression, every word could be dissected and twisted. The stakes were higher than ever. The Queen's will was not merely a document. It was a public declaration of preference, a subtle but powerful assertion of hierarchy. And Meghan, who had fought to carve out a space for herself, found that space shrinking before her eyes. Her thoughts inevitably turned to Harry, her husband, partner, and co-strategist in so many public and private battles, would feel the blow just as acutely as she did. He had always been protective, fiercely loyal, and occasionally impulsive in defending those he loved. How would he respond to this exclusion? Would he confront the family, risk public scandal, or advise caution, knowing the fragile balance of appearances must be maintained? Meghan knew that his counsel would be invaluable, but she also knew that decisions could not be delayed indefinitely. Time was a silent adversary, ticking relentlessly as the media, the public, and the palace moved inexorably toward the unfolding drama. Inside her private world, Meghan began to reflect on her relationships with those closest to her. Friends, confidants, advisors, each carried their own perspectives, biases, and agendas. Some would counsel patience, others bold action. Some would sympathize, others quietly warn against missteps that could amplify the scandal. The palace, after all, was an ecosystem of influence, each individual navigating a complex web of loyalty, ambition, and discretion. Meghan needed allies, but she also needed clarity. Who could be trusted? Who would act in her best interest? And who might use this crisis to their own advantage? The personal toll was significant. Meghan's emotions swirled unpredictably. Anger, hurt, disbelief, and determination collided in her mind. She thought of moments of private tension over the years, the subtle dismissals, the veiled criticisms, the moments where her presence seemed tolerated rather than celebrated. Were they precursors to this exclusion? Had she misread the signs, believing that her dedication, her public service, and her efforts to modernize aspects of royal life would earn her recognition? The realization was bitter. The palace did not reward ambition in isolation. It rewarded conformity, strategy, and alignment with unspoken codes. And yet, Meghan's mind was not solely consumed by frustration. Strategy began to take shape, almost instinctively. The Queen's will, while devastating, also presented opportunities. Legal avenues could be explored, public perception could be shaped, and narratives could be influenced. She considered the power of carefully timed statements, the management of media narratives, and the cultivation of allies both inside and outside the palace. Every choice carried risk, but inaction was far more dangerous. Meghan had survived scrutiny, scandal, and relentless media attacks before. She was nothing if not resilient, and the exclusion from the will could be transformed from a blow into a catalyst. The tension was compounded by the inevitable intrusion of the press. Reporters, photographers, and commentators were constantly on alert, scanning every public appearance for signs of distress, scandal, or conflict. Social media, with its instantaneous judgment and viral amplification, added another layer of pressure. Headlines would dissect her every reaction, from a slight frown to a measured smile. The narrative would be written before she could speak. And yet, the very immediacy of media scrutiny also offered a potential tool, a way to frame her story, to assert control over perception, and to respond strategically to the palace's silent judgment. Meghan's private world also included moments of introspection. She considered her own identity, her role within the monarchy, and the legacy she wished to leave behind. The Queen's exclusion was not merely a personal slight. It was a challenge to her sense of belonging, her influence, and her ability to shape outcomes. Meghan had always been ambitious, thoughtful, and deliberate. She had navigated the labyrinth of royal expectations, media scrutiny, and public perception with care and determination. This moment, painful and disorienting as it was, required the same combination of intellect, resilience, and strategy. As the hours passed, Meghan began to formulate a plan. She would need to consult with advisors, weigh legal options, and consider the timing of any public response. Every detail mattered: what was said, how it was said, when it was said, and to whom. The palace operated on protocols, unspoken rules, and centuries of precedent. Any misstep could be exploited, and the Queen's will had already set the stage for a narrative that could easily cast her as an outsider, an interloper, or a figure of controversy. Meghan needed precision, focus, and clarity. And yet, there was a personal dimension that could not be ignored. Emotional response, human instinct, and relational dynamics would inevitably influence decisions. How would Harry respond? How would family members interpret her reactions? Could she balance emotional truth with strategic calculation? The palace, with its ornate walls and centuries of tradition, offered little guidance. Meghan had to navigate not only the personal impact of exclusion, but also the broader implications for her relationships, public image, and future within the royal ecosystem. Amid this complex interplay of emotion, strategy, and potential scandal, Meghan recognized one undeniable truth: the world was watching. Every ally, every adversary, every member of the media, every member of the public would interpret her actions, her demeanor, and her choices. The stakes were immense, and the consequences of miscalculation could be permanent. Yet, within this intense scrutiny lay opportunity, the chance to assert agency, reclaim narrative control, and challenge perceptions. Meghan was acutely aware that the Queen's will, while exclusionary, also presented a moment of transformation. In this private world, Meghan considered her options. Legal recourse was one path. Media management was another. Strategic alliances, both within and outside the palace, offered further possibilities. Each path carried risk, and each path demanded courage, intelligence, and resolve. The Queen's document was a challenge, a provocation, and perhaps even an invitation. Meghan understood that the response would define not only her immediate circumstances, but also her legacy, influence, and the perception of her role within the royal family for years to come. And as Meghan paused, contemplating the path forward, a quiet determination settled over her. The initial shock had passed. The simmering anger had crystallized into resolve. The palace's walls, the media's scrutiny, and the Queen's deliberate choices had set the stage, but Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, was ready to take her next steps. Calculated, deliberate, and unapologetically determined, she would navigate the labyrinth of tradition, expectation, and power. But even in her private world, uncertainty lingered. Allies could betray, messages could leak, and actions could be misinterpreted. The palace was a living organism, unpredictable and deeply entrenched in protocol. Meghan understood that every choice carried potential consequences beyond her immediate perception. And yet, within this tension lay the thrill of agency, the chance to define her own narrative, assert her presence, and respond to the Queen's exclusion on her own terms. And then, a message arrived, discreet and urgent, from someone Meghan had not expected. One of the palace insiders, a figure usually silent, reached out privately. The contents of that message would shift the dynamics, offer unexpected options, and introduce an entirely new layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, had always been a study in poise and precision. To the public, she was the embodiment of grace, elegance, and measured composure. Behind the polished appearances, however, lay a woman attuned to the intricate rhythms of palace life, who understood the unspoken hierarchies, the subtle power plays, and the weight of history that her every action carried. And now, with the Queen's will revealed, Catherine's status had been elevated to a level few could have predicted. The document left her everything, a windfall that included not only estates and jewelry, but influence, authority, and the symbolic power that comes from being the central inheritor of royal legacy. The first indication of the scale of Catherine's inheritance came in the hushed corridors of the palace. Advisors whispered among themselves, careful not to disturb the Duchess, yet unable to contain the gravity of what had been revealed. Sandringham, Balmoral, private residences, and priceless family heirlooms were designated for her care and stewardship. The weight of history now rested squarely on her shoulders, and Catherine bore it with the calm, unwavering expression that had become her trademark. Yet, for those who knew her well, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a recognition that this windfall was more than mere property. It was influence, power, and a reinforcement of her central role in the monarchy's narrative. From the moment the will became known, reactions within the family were varied. Some expressed quiet admiration, others barely concealed envy, and a few harbored private resentment. Catherine, for her part, remained unflappable. Every handshake, Every smile, every public engagement reflected her understanding of the responsibility now placed upon her. She knew that the windfall was not simply about possession, it was about perception. The public, already captivated by royal affairs, would interpret this inheritance as an endorsement of her standing, a signal of her role in shaping the monarchy's future. And yet, Catherine's calm exterior masked a strategic mind at work. She was acutely aware of the ripple effects. Meghan's exclusion was glaring, and the contrast between the two sisters-in-law could not be ignored. Catherine understood that every move, every appearance, every interaction would now be examined through the lens of the will. Public perception, media narratives, and palace gossip would converge to create a story in which she was the central figure and Meghan was the outsider. Managing this dynamic required finesse, patience, and precision. A misstep, however minor, could destabilize the careful balance she had cultivated. The Duchess had always demonstrated an ability to navigate complex situations with subtlety. In meetings with advisors, she discussed the responsibilities accompanying her inheritance with deliberate care. She understood that wealth, while tangible, was only one facet of power. Influence, reputation, and public trust were equally crucial. Catherine's approach was methodical. She would accept the Queen's gifts with gratitude, manage the estates and assets with diligence, and position herself as the rightful steward of the family's legacy. Every decision, every action, reinforced her stature while carefully avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Meghan's exclusion, however, introduced a new variable. The Duchess of Cambridge was well aware of the potential for tension, for media speculation, and for public scrutiny. Catherine had cultivated her image carefully over the years, always composed, always measured, and now that image would be contrasted sharply with Meghan's. The public would inevitably notice the disparity, the emotional responses, and the differences in approach. Catherine's challenge was to maintain her composure while ensuring that her inherited position was not misinterpreted as cold or calculated. She needed to balance perception with reality, influence with responsibility, and empathy with strategic acumen. In private conversations with close confidants, Catherine expressed awareness of the delicate balance she must maintain. The inheritance was monumental, yes, but with it came responsibility that extended beyond material assets. She would need to manage estates, historical properties, and priceless heirlooms with care, while also addressing the expectations of family members, advisors, and the public. Every decision, every action, and every statement would be scrutinized for signs of favoritism, mismanagement, or imbalance. Catherine understood the weight of perception almost as acutely as she understood the tangible value of her inheritance. Meanwhile, Meghan's reaction was a constant consideration. Catherine knew that the excluded Duchess would be processing the news privately, navigating her own network of advisors, and likely planning potential responses. Any confrontation, public statement, or strategic maneuver by Meghan could alter the dynamics of power within the family. Catherine's challenge was not merely to enjoy the benefits of the windfall, but to anticipate and manage the ripple effects that Meghan's response could generate. The tension between composure and vigilance was delicate, and Catherine was adept at walking that line. The palace itself became a stage for subtle power dynamics. Staffers, courtiers, and advisors observed the interplay between the two duchesses with keen interest. Rumors began to circulate, quietly, cautiously, about how Meghan might respond, and whether her exclusion would precipitate confrontation or public disclosure. Catherine, ever aware of the optics, maintained her calm, ensuring that her actions reinforced her position while minimizing opportunities for unnecessary escalation. Every handshake, every smile, and every public appearance was calculated to convey dignity, responsibility, and strategic awareness. The public's fascination with Catherine's windfall was immediate. Media outlets dissected the will, highlighting the contrast between her inheritance and Meghan's exclusion. Commentators speculated about favoritism, family dynamics, and potential future conflicts. Social media amplified every observation, turning subtle gestures into headline-worthy moments. Catherine's task was to navigate this heightened scrutiny without betraying emotion, without allowing the narrative to shift into territory that could threaten her standing, and without providing fuel for Meghan's potential strategies. Yet beneath the calm, Catherine was aware that this windfall was not a simple blessing. It was a responsibility that required careful stewardship, strategic foresight, and an understanding of the broader implications for family dynamics, public perception, and the monarchy's future. Each decision carried weight, each action influenced perception, and each relationship had the potential to either support or complicate her position. Catherine's ability to navigate this landscape would define not only her immediate role, but also her long-term influence within the royal family. And so, while Meghan wrestled with shock, anger, and the sense of exclusion, Catherine prepared quietly, thoughtfully, and deliberately. Her windfall was both an opportunity and a challenge, one that demanded careful management of assets, relationships, and perception. Every step she took was deliberate, every gesture calculated, every interaction a reinforcement of her central role in the unfolding narrative. But even in her composed strategy, a new complication was emerging. The palace, the media, and Meghan's advisors were all poised to act, and Catherine knew that one miscalculated move, by herself or by others, could shift the balance dramatically. The inheritance was monumental, but its consequences were unpredictable, and as the days unfolded, the quiet corridors of the palace would become a battleground of influence, perception, and subtle power plays, each twist potentially altering the trajectory of both duchesses. And then, a confidential message arrived for Catherine, unseen by Meghan or any palace staff. Its contents were simple yet explosive, a hint that Meghan was planning something unexpected, a move that could challenge the very authority and perception Catherine had been meticulously cultivating. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, usually a place of measured elegance and disciplined routine, had taken on a tense, almost electric atmosphere. The Queen's will, now a document of public and private knowledge, had sent ripples through every level of the royal household. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones, advisors exchanged discreet glances, and even the staff, those who rarely interfered with family matters, felt the palpable shift in energy. The palace, in essence, had become a theater of tension, each room a stage for unspoken conflict. It began with small observations. A missed handshake here, a tense smile there, subtle nods and carefully timed glances, all magnified in the interpretive lens of a staff attuned to centuries of protocol and behavior. Catherine's poise and calm contrasted starkly with Meghan's simmering emotions. Her serene presence was a statement in itself, an embodiment of the windfall she had just received. Meghan's exclusion was evident in every subtle movement, from a tightened jaw to an imperceptible pause as she entered the room. Those who watched closely knew a storm was brewing, but its trajectory remained uncertain. The Queen's advisors, experienced and cautious, moved quickly to contain any immediate fallout. Legal teams reviewed the implications of the will, ensuring that there were no loopholes or ambiguities that could be exploited. PR strategists discussed potential media narratives, assessing the risk of leaks, and calculating how different interpretations could influence public perception. Every word, every gesture, and every document became a point of interest. In the palace, even silence carried weight, and Meghan's reactions, though private, were under constant scrutiny. The situation became more complex when whispers of leaked information began circulating outside the palace walls. Unverified reports hinted at the scale of Catherine's inheritance and Meghan's exclusion, igniting a media frenzy. Headlines multiplied like wildfire. Catherine crowned by will. Meghan snubbed in Queen's final testament. Royal tensions rise. Social media platforms erupted with speculation, dividing public opinion and fueling debates about favoritism, fairness, and the inner workings of the monarchy. Every post, every comment, every viral article created pressure not only on the duchesses themselves, but also on the broader family, who were forced to navigate a growing storm of public scrutiny. Inside the palace, advisors attempted to manage both perception and internal dynamics. Meetings were called in private chambers, discussions held behind closed doors, and strategies formulated to maintain order. The Queen, despite her absence, had left a legacy of precision, and her will was treated as an unassailable document, not to be questioned publicly. Yet its consequences were immediate, unpredictable, and potentially destabilizing. The palace was caught between tradition, protocol, and the very human reactions of those affected. Meghan, aware of the swirling chaos, began taking her own steps. Private consultations with trusted aides, discussions about legal recourse, and careful analysis of media responses became her focus. She was determined to respond strategically, but the challenge was enormous. Balancing emotional authenticity with calculated restraint, addressing personal feelings of betrayal while preparing for the inevitable public narrative. The palace, a web of alliances and hierarchies, offered both opportunity and risk. Every interaction, from casual conversations to formal meetings, required careful navigation. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to project calm and control. Every public appearance was meticulously managed, every gesture carefully measured. Behind the scenes, however, she too faced the pressures of uncertainty. Meghan's potential moves, whether legal, public, or private, loomed as variables that could disrupt her careful stewardship of the Queen's inheritance. Advisors advised vigilance, reminding her that the optics were as important as the reality. Perception could define influence, and influence could be challenged at any moment. Catherine, while projecting calm, also began making subtle preparations. She reviewed her assets, consulted with legal and financial advisors, and considered public appearances that would reinforce her role as the steward of the Queen's legacy. Every decision was carefully considered, with an awareness of Meghan's potential moves and the public's insatiable appetite for drama. Even minor actions, a well-timed smile, a measured statement, were calculated to maintain composure while signaling authority and influence. The palace had become a chessboard of strategy. Every participant, Meghan, Catherine, advisors, staffers, occupied positions of influence, each capable of moving pieces in ways that could shift power, perception, and control. The Queen's will was no longer simply a document. It had become the catalyst for a high-stakes game, where every choice, every gesture, and every whispered word could have monumental consequences. And then, the first real spark of confrontation arrived. A private communication, delivered discreetly to Meghan by a trusted insider, revealed that someone within the palace might be willing to assist her in challenging the narrative, in asserting influence, and in reshaping perceptions. The possibilities were tantalizing, the risks immense, and the timing critical. For the first time since reading the will, Meghan felt a surge of anticipation, an opportunity to act, to influence, to turn the chaos of the palace to her advantage. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The private quarters of Meghan Markle, usually a sanctuary of calm and reflection, had transformed into a chamber of raw emotion. The Queen's will had shattered the equilibrium she had painstakingly maintained, leaving her in a vortex of disbelief, frustration, and simmering rage. No matter how much she tried to steady her breathing, to present the composed figure the world expected, the truth was undeniable. She had been left out entirely, while Catherine inherited the full weight of the Queen's legacy. The exclusion was not only a personal affront. It was a public statement, a declaration that Meghan, despite her marriage into the royal family, was peripheral, disposable, and, perhaps most painfully, unworthy of inclusion in the institution she had committed herself to. The first moments after reading the will were consumed by shock. Her hands, which had trembled while breaking the envelope, now clutched at her head as if to physically absorb the reality. Meghan's mind replayed the moments of her public life, the carefully curated engagements, the countless hours spent in service, the endless scrutiny endured. Every effort, every compromise, every attempt to integrate into the royal family seemed rendered invisible in a single stroke of pen on paper. And yet, within that shock was the undeniable awareness that this moment demanded a response, not out of impulse, but with strategy, precision, and intention. The emotional toll was immediate and unrelenting. Meghan paced, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as her thoughts spun in every direction. Anger surged in waves, colliding with hurt and disbelief. How could the Queen, who had been seen as fair and deliberate, favor Catherine so completely? Was it a reflection of loyalty, a reward for measured compliance, or a calculated snub? Every possibility gnawed at her, intensifying her inner turmoil. The personal had become political, and the political had become deeply, painfully personal. Tears welled in her eyes, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming weight of betrayal. To be excluded was one thing. To be contrasted so starkly with Catherine's windfall was another entirely. Meghan had entered the royal family with hope and ambition, believing in her capacity to contribute, to make a difference, to carve a legacy of service and compassion. Now, all of that effort seemed overshadowed by the silent judgment embedded in the Queen's final decision. The room, usually a place of comfort, felt claustrophobic, every shadow a reminder of exclusion and loss. Her thoughts turned, inevitably, to Harry. He was her anchor, her partner in both love and rebellion against the constraints of tradition. How would he process this revelation? Would he react with protective fury, defending her against perceived slights? Or would he counsel caution, reminding her of the precarious balance of public perception? The weight of their shared history pressed down on her. The moments of alliance, the private strategies, the unspoken understanding that together they had navigated some of the harshest scrutiny imaginable. But this was different. This was a direct, undeniable exclusion, one that demanded consideration, conversation, and potentially confrontation. As Meghan's emotional intensity swelled, she began to oscillate between private despair and calculated thought. There was fury, yes, a raw, human response to being overlooked and marginalized. But there was also strategy. She could not afford to act impulsively, even as the fire of indignation burned within her. Legal avenues existed. Media narratives could be shaped. Advisors could provide counsel. And alliances, both within and outside the palace, could be leveraged to influence outcomes. Every choice carried risk, yet inaction carried the greater peril, a silence that could be interpreted as acquiescence or weakness. Amidst the emotional storm, Meghan recalled the numerous public moments that had defined her life in the royal spotlight. Engagements with charities, media appearances, official ceremonies, and private gatherings. Each had been a performance, carefully balanced to reflect duty, empathy, and composure. And now, in the aftermath of the will, those moments seemed reframed. Public perception, already fickle and intensely scrutinizing, could recast her history as peripheral, as controversial, as secondary to the central narrative of Catherine's inheritance. The potential damage to her reputation, influence, and legacy was immense, and it demanded immediate consideration. Her meltdown was not solely private. In conversations with her closest aides, Meghan's emotions were palpable. Her voice carried both restraint and tremor, blending controlled articulation with the undercurrent of profound hurt. Advisors listened carefully, balancing empathy with strategy, acknowledging the emotional weight while considering the tactical implications. Every discussion, every consultation, became an exercise in navigating dual realities: the human response to betrayal and the strategic response to institutional exclusion. Simultaneously, Meghan's mind raced with scenarios of potential action. Should she confront family members directly? Should she engage with media intermediaries to subtly influence public narrative? Could legal challenges provide leverage or force disclosure? Each possibility was weighed meticulously, the calculus of risk versus reward dominating her thought processes even as the emotional intensity surged. The interplay of personal grievance and strategic opportunity created a tension that was both exhausting and galvanizing. Despite the turmoil, moments of clarity emerged. Meghan recognized that the Queen's will, while excluding her, also illuminated pathways for agency. Exclusion was not an endpoint, it was a challenge. It was an invitation to assert influence, craft narrative, and redefine her position within the royal landscape. She understood that every decision in the coming days could reverberate across public perception, media coverage, and familial dynamics. The emotional meltdown, while real and justified, was also a precursor to strategic action, a catharsis that allowed her to harness anger and betrayal into focused determination. Even as she processed these thoughts, Meghan considered the broader implications. The contrast between her exclusion and Catherine's windfall would dominate conversations, both private and public. Allies and adversaries alike would interpret every gesture, every statement, every interaction through this lens. Managing these dynamics required precision, foresight, and resilience. She had navigated scrutiny and criticism before, but the combination of personal betrayal and public perception presented a challenge unparalleled in its intensity and complexity. The emotional crescendo reached a moment of profound realization. She could not remain passive. The palace, the public, and the media were all participants in a drama that had already begun to unfold, and her response would shape its trajectory. Whether through legal channels, strategic engagement, or carefully managed media interventions, Meghan understood that she needed to act decisively, balancing emotional authenticity with tactical acumen. The stakes were monumental, the risks high, and the potential rewards, control of narrative, preservation of legacy, and assertion of agency, equally significant. And as Meghan's meltdown evolved from raw emotion to focused determination, a new variable entered the picture. A trusted aide, discreet and loyal, delivered an unexpected message. Someone within the inner circles of the palace had observed Catherine's preparation and perceived Meghan's distress. The message hinted at possibilities, alliances, strategic interventions, and potential leverage that could shift the balance of influence. The revelation was both exhilarating and daunting, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the emotional storm. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In the shadowed corridors of the palace, alliances were forged in whispers and broken with a glance. Every courtier, advisor, and staff member had a role, a loyalty, and a vested interest in the unfolding drama. Meghan Markle, having just experienced the sting of exclusion from the Queen's will, now faced a delicate web of relationships where every friend could be a potential betrayer and every adversary could be an unexpected ally. The stakes were higher than ever. One misstep could ignite scandal, one misinterpreted gesture could alter public perception, and one poorly chosen confidant could leak sensitive information to the media. Meghan began to map her network carefully. Allies were few but crucial. Her personal aides, loyal and discreet, had been with her through relentless media scrutiny and public criticism. They knew her strengths, her vulnerabilities, and the nuances of her strategy. Each conversation with them was measured, every word considered, every reaction observed. These advisors were the first line of defense and the architects of potential countermoves. Their guidance could shape narrative, influence outcomes, and protect Meghan from immediate fallout. At the same time, Meghan had to consider adversaries, those whose loyalty was questionable, whose ambitions might conflict with hers, or whose judgment might align more closely with Catherine's interests. Within the palace, rivalries were subtle, often invisible to the untrained eye. A smile could conceal disdain. A compliment could mask calculation. Meghan understood that she had to navigate these relationships with extreme caution, balancing openness with discretion, collaboration with strategic reservation. Every action carried potential consequences, some immediate, others unfolding over months or years. The first step was assessment. Meghan meticulously evaluated her relationships, categorizing individuals based on loyalty, influence, and reliability. Trusted aides, distant family members, and sympathetic courtiers formed the inner circle, a network she could rely upon for confidential counsel and strategic support. Outside this circle were those whose loyalties were ambiguous, capable of offering assistance, but potentially exploitable by Catherine's camp or the palace hierarchy. Meghan recognized that even minor misjudgments could result in leaks, miscommunications, or unintended escalation of tensions. Communication became a tool of both reassurance and strategy. Meghan engaged in private conversations, carefully balancing emotional authenticity with tactical subtlety. She allowed glimpses of her hurt to humanize her to her allies while signaling determination, resilience, and calculated intent. Each conversation was a performance of sorts, measured yet genuine, controlled yet expressive. The message to her allies was clear. She would not be passive, she would not be sidelined, and she would act with purpose. Simultaneously, Meghan had to anticipate the moves of potential adversaries. Catherine's calm and calculated approach to her windfall was evident, and Meghan understood that the Duchess of Cambridge had likely assessed the landscape thoroughly. Any attempt to challenge Catherine directly would need careful orchestration, weighing both public perception and internal palace dynamics. Meghan considered the possibility of indirect influence, using media, social connections, or strategic engagements to assert presence and power without overt confrontation. Every action required foresight, timing, and an understanding of how perception would ripple through the palace and the public. Amid this intricate web of relationships, Meghan also had to contend with media scrutiny. Trusted allies could offer channels for controlled disclosures, subtle hints, and narrative framing. But the media was unpredictable, capable of amplifying, distorting, or misrepresenting any information. Meghan's strategy had to incorporate both containment and leverage, protecting sensitive information while using it to shape perceptions when appropriate. The balance between transparency and discretion became a central concern, with every choice carrying potential impact on reputation, influence, and public sympathy. The emotional dimension could not be ignored. Allies provided reassurance, counsel, and strategic guidance, but they also reinforced the emotional intensity of the situation. Meghan's sense of betrayal, hurt, and indignation was magnified in these interactions, a reminder that personal investment and loyalty were deeply intertwined. At the same time, adversaries' subtle cues, an evasive glance, a cautious remark, a calculated compliment, kept her alert, reinforcing the necessity of vigilance, discernment, and strategic foresight. Complicating matters further, rumors began circulating within the palace. Whispers of potential confrontations, media leaks, and strategic maneuvering created a tense atmosphere where every interaction was potentially consequential. Allies became temporary fortresses, while adversaries morphed into potential threats. Meghan's ability to navigate these shifting dynamics, maintain composure, and make informed decisions was tested at every turn. Each day became a careful balancing act, where perception, influence, and strategy intersected with emotion, ambition, and loyalty. Even the smallest gestures, sharing a private comment with an aide, scheduling a discreet meeting with a confidant, or offering a seemingly casual response in conversation, required meticulous consideration. Meghan understood that her actions were scrutinized not only by the palace but also by the media, the public, and, crucially, by Catherine's camp. Every choice could alter power dynamics, affect public perception, or shift alliances. The stakes were immense, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Amid this high-stakes environment, Meghan also considered potential opportunities. Allies within the palace might provide intelligence, influence, or channels for negotiation. Strategic engagement with sympathetic media could shape narrative, provide leverage, and build public support. Even seemingly minor interactions with distant relatives or courtiers could yield insights, alliances, or tactical advantage. Meghan's strategy became a multi-layered operation. Emotional resilience, alliance management, media engagement, and anticipatory planning all converged into a comprehensive approach to reclaim influence and assert presence. But perhaps most critical was Meghan's understanding of timing. Actions taken too soon could provoke confrontation or backlash. Actions delayed could be interpreted as weakness or acquiescence. The calculus of timing, always delicate, became central to her approach. Every decision, from private consultation to public engagement, had to be precisely calibrated to maximize influence while minimizing risk. The palace, with its centuries of protocol and unspoken hierarchy, demanded nothing less. And then, as Meghan navigated this intricate landscape of allies and enemies, a subtle shift occurred. A previously silent figure, someone whose loyalties had been ambiguous, reached out privately with information that could alter the balance of power. The message was cryptic but loaded with potential, a strategic insight, an opportunity to influence perception, and a hint that Catherine's careful composure might not be as unassailable as it appeared. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the story of the Queen's will began to circulate beyond palace walls, the media erupted. Headlines blazed across tabloids and online platforms with a sensational intensity. Catherine crowned by Queen's final will, Meghan snubbed. Royal rift deepens. Windfall shock rocks Buckingham Palace. Social media followed almost instantaneously, with influencers, commentators, and fans dissecting every nuance, every rumor, every tiny gesture in the public record. The narrative spun out of the private chambers of Buckingham Palace into a worldwide spectacle, where perception became as consequential as reality. For Meghan, the media frenzy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it amplified her exclusion in a way that felt humiliating and personal. On the other, it offered channels through which she could subtly assert her presence and influence the narrative. She had always understood the power of media, of public perception, and of storytelling. Now, more than ever, she needed to navigate carefully, balancing visibility with discretion. A misstep could be catastrophic. A calculated move could turn public scrutiny into strategic advantage. The tabloids, as expected, thrived on contrast. Catherine, composed and elegant, became the focus of admiration and speculation. Meghan, emotional and excluded, was framed as the outsider, the figure reacting to circumstance rather than shaping it. Social media commentary ranged from sympathetic to critical, with fervent debates about fairness, favoritism, and the role of tradition in modern monarchy. Memes proliferated, hashtags trended, and every public appearance of either duchess was dissected for subtext and hidden meaning. Advisors worked frantically behind the scenes. Meghan's team, well-versed in media management, coordinated messaging, monitored leaks, and strategized interventions. Every quote, every social engagement, every photographed moment had to be evaluated for both immediate impact and long-term narrative consequences. Simultaneously, Catherine's advisors ensured that the Duchess of Cambridge maintained her aura of calm authority, reinforcing her central position in the Queen's legacy. The palace itself became a hub of constant assessment, calculation, and anticipation. Meghan's emotional stakes were heightened by the unpredictability of public opinion. Supporters rallied to her side, championing her resilience, courage, and outsider status. Critics questioned her suitability, her choices, and her ability to navigate royal life with grace. The polarization was intense, with both sides amplifying every gesture, every statement, and every appearance. For Meghan, the challenge was not merely managing the press.